everyone, and welcome to the round 12 recap of the women's candidates. My name is Svetlana, and today I thought we would do something a little bit different. We will go over all 4 games of the round, focusing on some key, most interesting moments. Honestly, this is because I couldn't choose. All the games were very dramatic and really cool with a lot to learn from them. So we'll take a look at each. The standings before round 12 were Vaishali in the lead with 7 points, Anna Muzychuk and Zhu with 6 points, Bibisara Assubayeva and Katerina Lagno at 5.5, Alexandra Goryachkina and Deshmukh at 5, and Tan Zhongyi at 4 points. The first game that we will see was between Vaishali and Zhu Jiner because it was a very important result for the leaderboard. Zhu Jiner won their first encounter in the candidates, but needed to win now to catch up and share first place. So now Vaishali is playing with white and Zhu with black. Let's see how it went. It started with a relatively calm Caro-Kann with the advanced variation and bishop f5. Here, Vaishali went bishop here, bishop took, and she made an unusual choice to take with the pawn instead of taking with the queen. Normally, this is the plan with just castling and playing c3. That's the usual pawn structure, but it was a bit different. This move has been played about 100 times, so it's not a complete novelty, but definitely rare. I think it was played mostly for the surprise element, although these doubled pawns can definitely become a weakness, but most likely they will not stay this way because black's main plan still stays c5. So something will happen to these pawns and they will not stay this way long term. The game continued like this with both sides just developing, although white was starting to play rather ambitiously with this h4, but things were pretty closed and calm for the next while. Both sides are pretty flexible, not committing to castling just yet. And h5. Here the rook is indirectly targeting that knight on c6, so for now black is not able to take. So they are defending with queen c8. Now some pawn structure changes follow, with d takes c5 and b takes c5. For the next part of the game, the evaluation drifts from a slight advantage to black to slight advantage to white, so it really goes like this, and there's mild inaccuracies by both, but it's nothing major, and it's a very complex position, so it's not surprising. So for now, white went queen a4 and then castled, and then defended the pawn. Black is also trying to make regular useful moves, and the queen swings over. This is a very unique middle game. It's full of life, it's a bit untypical for the pawn structure, and it's very hard to know what's the right plan, both for white and for black. So each decides to focus on a few weaknesses to target. Black plays this to attack on d3. The knight defends, and now black needs to decide what to do with their king. If they start to castle, for example, with bishop e7 and castles, then there might be some problems, like bishop h6 here, but in general, all of white's pieces are kind of ready to attack. So this doesn't look too good. So instead, she plays rook g8 to keep the king in the middle forever, because it's pretty safe there. There's no open files, and instead open the g file to attack the white king. So that's why the rook is there, because next move there's g5. Now, white doesn't want to just let this attack happen, so they take and actually start something of their own with d4. This is a very good move, and it shows a really good understanding of this position by Vaishali. This lets white have a bit more space, because right now the pieces were a bit cramped. The idea is that if black takes, then there's a4 kicking out the queen, and then the knight coming to d3. Although it looks a bit shaky, this works out, and white's pieces are finally coming to life. And white would be pretty much better here. Even despite black having all these tactics, it still works out. Instead, in the game, Zhu plays bishop e7, normal developing move. White also tries to solidify. And now c4, another pawn break. Here, taking was a bit of an inaccuracy because it ended up doing something not obvious at first, but important later. It frees up this d5 square for the black knight. Instead, she should just let black take. If they want to take, that activates the knight. But this is what happened in the game, and then time trouble starts happening to both players. The position is still very complex. Knight to b4 is now targeting that d5 square, but not only that, also that d3 square looks very good for the knight. And white now starts to deal with some problems. The rook has to move. The queen wants to go away from the pin, and now rook f to b1. Very complex still, but black finds the best move in the position, which is rook to b5. This saves the rook from the pin, so now the knight can move freely, and from now on, black is kind of starting to take over the position. Vaishali does find the best move, which is d5. It's, again, a wonderful move because it's out of necessity. It's needed to stay in the game. It works for dynamic reasons, so white does give up that pawn forever, but at least it lets the knights and the bishop to have that d4 square that they really, really need to do something in this game. It also includes some tricks, so if black takes, then there's a nice fork, and if black takes like this, there's one more fork with the knight, so it would have been nice, but black doesn't fall for it and takes with the knight instead. Queen e4, so there's a lot of pins going on here now that knight is pinned. But still, it's really difficult for white to play this position because white is down a pawn. So although the pieces look more active, they will need to deal with this pawn forever being on black's side. For now, things are being held together, but black has not forgotten about that attack that they started on the g-file, so it begins now with h5 and rook to g4. Vaishali here is looking for counterplay, which is the right thing to do, so tries to invade with the queen. The game goes on, and it's always very, very close, but black does have enough defensive resources. Rook here is very solid, very well supported by the pawn. So takes, and white has almost recovered. The pieces are working, and nothing is too bad just yet, but next move she makes the decisive mistake. She plays knight to c1, which makes sense to attack this pawn, but it is just a bit passive and it gives black that one extra move that they needed. There was a save, but it was a very difficult save. She should play something like queen h5, and then the knight to e1. There's also knight g1, but they are very backwards moves that are super precise, and that queen needs to come back, regain that pawn on b3. Honestly, it's basically not findable in combination. Maybe one move or two moves you will find, but combining these ideas is very, very difficult, especially in time trouble. So I'm not sure who would have found that, but that was basically the only few saves left in that position. Knight c1 instead happened, and that was the mistake. You can try to pause the video here and find the winning move for Zhu Jiner. A few moves work, but it's all really beautiful, and most of it depends on one idea. So try to find it as black. You can take your time, pause the video. So the move was h3. It looks really nice, and that pawn cannot be taken. If it gets taken with the pawn, there is knight to c3, which is very nice, attacking both the rook and that knight on f3. And if the queen takes, then there's knight f4. And that should be deadly for the white king once that g2 pawn falls. A few other moves that won were queen c6 and also knight to f4, but honestly, a lot of them rely on that h3 idea later anyway. So hopefully you found this one. And that's what she found in the game. Vaishali takes the pawn, but black's pawn is much more dangerous now on g2. King to g1 doesn't help either because of knight f4, and now there's both that threat of knight ae2 and also that knight hanging, so just too many things are under attack. So in the game she goes king h2. Now a beautiful promotion happens. If the rook gets distracted, then this knight gets lost, and that is not enough for white to be down a piece. So the knight took instead, but knight to c3 with a really nice idea to attack the rook and also threaten mate at the same time. Vaishali resigned here. This was definitely heartbreaking because she was in the lead by 1 full point and everything looked great, but Jiner did play great in this game, especially in those critical moments. So now this creates a tie for the lead between Vaishali and Zhu Jiner, which makes the tournament even more interesting to follow in the final rounds, but I really hope they both do their best for the final rounds as well. Everyone is very close in strength here, so as we can see, everything comes down to nerves and to these very few critical moves. So let's check on the other games and see how they change the standings as well. This one is between Bibisara Assubayeva as white and Katerina Lagno as black. This was definitely the most chaotic game of the event. Even looking at it was just insane, but there's a lot to learn from it too. It started with bishop c4, bishop c5, and c3. Very typical move for now. And d4. This is all highly theoretical. Bishop b4 check. White now has a choice. They can play either knight to d2, knight c3, bishop to d2. She chooses knight b to d2, which is not the main line. The main line is bishop here. And after takes, there's d5. This is known to be very drawish at top level. Looking through the database, it was almost all the draws for some reason. But knight b to d2 is what happened. So that keeps the game a bit more complex, but still very theoretical, which both of them knew, but was definitely prepared by Bibisara because she's the one that chose to go for it. Lagno plays d5. That's the main move in these positions. You cannot allow white to have that center. You could also try knight e4, but that leads to d5 as per the theoretical line, and then something like h4 or long castle. So white is down a pawn, but they do have that compensation and some good attacking prospects for the future, but definitely dangerous. So maybe that's what she was intending. And instead, d5 is what happened. So this leads to a bit more positional play with both sides castling and then a3. This is all theory so far. Very typical moves from both. Bishop gets kicked out, and now bishop h5. This is where Bibisara thought for the first time, and she ended up finding the best move. It is bishop back to a2. So just retreating for now, seeing what black does, and making sure to set up the queen and the bishop, and also potentially places for this knight in the future. So this is a great move. White got a pretty good position out of the opening, but it's still very, very double-edged. So the point is that black wants to move this knight, so they move it away, and that bishop is now no longer under attack. And this gives white that extra move, with which she plays g4, which is very courageous. It looks a bit dangerous, but it's actually good. So bishop back. Now knight to e4 was a bit more active, but definitely scary to play this with that pawn on g4. Instead, she plays knight back to f1 with similar ideas. Lagno, of course, is trying to be active as well. Activates the bishop and the queen. And now Bibisara goes knight e5. Everything is protected, so this is a safe move. Bishop took it. the bishop got kicked out, and they're mutually offering that queen trade and nobody really wants to take it. So the bishop retreated. If black took that queen, then it's white who gets control of that d-file, and that is very important, especially because there's even f4 coming next. That bishop is going to be out of the game, so all of black's pieces are just a bit out of play and not attacking anything. Black doesn't want to take, so they play queen d4, and now white doesn't want to take, because if they take, that knight gets activated, and it starts threatening knight f3, knight c2, and nobody really wants to deal with that. So both of them are avoiding these trades. And here's where black takes a very dangerous pawn. Queen takes b2. Things get really messy around here. Black is now up a pawn, but white's pieces are going to try to take advantage of that. They're also not the most coordinated right now, but still, Bibisara tries to go for it with f4. It's very interesting how both of them are actually making the top moves, but the position is just so double-edged that I'm sure it took a lot of effort to evaluate all of these options. And this is keeping the game very, very tense, so bishop c2 is correct. Now the queen trade is avoided. Here rook e3 was played, but e6 was also a pretty good try. Which will be a move later in the game as well, as you'll see. But for now, just rook e3. Lagno responds with queen d4, which is a cute trap that this queen is completely tied to defending its own rooks, so it is not able to take that bishop. So the bishop defends, queen a4, all of these are great moves. The quality of this middle game was honestly very high considering how confusing this position is. So it's really cool that they were able to find all of this and play this correctly. And both of them are playing for initiative, so it's both white attacking and black attacking at the same time. White's queen went to b2, knight to d5. This knight definitely needs to be eliminated because white cannot handle it invading somewhere next to the king. So bishop took, and rook c1. The bishop is attacked, so it goes away. And queen b7. This game is really all about pawn grabbing. I don't know the last time I've seen both players do it in the same game, both on b2 and on b7. Both of these pawns were not even poisoned. It's just that they temporarily give some initiative to the opponent, and it becomes very chaotic, which is very true to this game. Bishop went back to protect everything, and queen c7 here was the first big mistake of the game. She should instead play e6, which seems to be a good move in most of these positions. After takes, the rook takes. With queen c7 instead, she wants to take that pawn, which is logical, but that allows black to play knight to d4, which is a great move, and suddenly white's rooks are feeling a bit uncomfortable with that knight coming so close. Knight e2 is threatened, so it gets defended, but now there's knight c2 fork. However, they didn't blunder this. This was all calculated. The rook is able to attack the queen first and get away, and then the other rook can get away. At this point, there's 25 minutes on the clock for Bibisara and 6 minutes on the clock for Lagno. And that actually ended up being very important here, because with how complicated this position is, the time is often what decides the final outcome. Both players need to be very precise, and it's very, very difficult to do when you don't know the evaluation. So they just need to try to do their best and try to pose as many problems for the opponent as they can. Here, Lagno played rook to d2, which was a relatively good move, but there was actually a more clear-cut win with bishop d3. And I'm saying it's clear, but it's actually very, very difficult to find it. The rook is feeling a bit trapped, so it needs to go to f4 of all places, because I'm not sure where else it can even go. the idea is queen b2 attacking the other rook. The other rook moves away, and now bishop to e2. To me, this is definitely the hardest move in this whole sequence, where you just give up that rook, and you need to see that it actually works due to queen c1, king g2, and not even this, not even taking that rook, but the knight discovered attack with a check on that queen, which is quite fascinating. And these are all really, really beautiful tactics, but I do think that finding bishop e2 here with that idea is quite difficult when there's so many other good options to choose from, which rook d2 looks great too, which is why she plays it. This does give Bibisara some initiative to play e6. Pawn took. Now queen to f4, so she wasn't really able to take back like this because of the bishop on f2, and taking back with the rook led to queen b2 with a pretty good advantage for black. Black is winning, once again, for all of these dynamic reasons. So instead, queen f4, which also keeps some chances alive, and this became the beginning of the wrong idea for Lagno. It's a very tough position with 5 minutes on the clock, and I think she was so focused on the opponent's attack that she leaves her own king defenseless. So she's very focused on trying to make something happen around the white king, because that's exactly what it looks like. You want to attack that king, it's so open, all of your pieces are ready, but when it's not quite there, you start to get nervous and start spending time. So the right move here is bishop c6, which is not that easy because you leave your own rook unprotected to attack this one. And on knight f3, you would play rook d3 and play on, and black is winning. But this is, once again, this is what the computer says. As a human, it's very hard to know what is actually the right move. She plays a very logical rook f to d8, but this ends up being a mistake, and this brings the position back to equal, which honestly sometimes feels so strange how it can go from one side to completely the other side in a matter of a few moves, but that's what happens here. White now takes on e6, and suddenly this king is also in trouble. Black should play queen a3 and still bring that bishop to c8, c6 instead, but she plays rook d1. Once again, it makes sense to go for something forcing because that's all you can really calculate when the position is so tense. But king g2, and this king is more or less safe. So she does find bishop c6, but it is a bit late. And here you can try to guess what white should play, if you'd like to guess it for Bibisara here, because this was, to me, one of the critical moments. You can pause the video if you want. And I think there's two main options here. It's a choice between e7 and queen f7. You can say which one you prefer. In the game, Bibisara played queen to f7, but that was actually a mistake. Instead, e7 is the winning move, so good job if you found that. Still some work left to do, of course, but it's very hard for black to defend this from promoting, so suddenly this pawn just ended up deciding the game. Queen f7 is met with queen to e5, and the thing is, there's no way to stop that pawn on the next move. I mean, black can try to create their own attack, but this would come with check. So anything else too is not working out because of that threat, and all of other black's pieces are also hanging. So it's difficult to do anything. Instead, she plays queen here, and then another queen check, and this is where Lagno had her chance to play g6, which looks like it completely opens up the king, but white has nothing better than just this perpetual. They have to go for the repetition. They could try to play something else, but then queen b7 is actually very strong because it capitalizes on this pin and turns it around to attack white instead. So everything else just loses. And white needs to go for some sort of repetition. Instead, she plays king to g8, which was very, very sad because maybe she thought that this is going to be a repetition as well. If white played it once, maybe they'll repeat it again. But now Bibisara doesn't let it happen for the second time and plays e7, which is the winning move. Queen b7 was a great move before, but it's just not enough here because everything comes with check. Queen e8 right away is not working though, so it's still full of tricks. Because of this king, the rook cannot take back. So first queen e6 check, and then queen takes c6, which is a really beautiful sacrifice, and this ends up giving white an extra piece in the end. They still played a couple of moves, but white is up a piece and is pretty safe, and there's nothing that black has against the white king. This was definitely the most chaotic game of the round. I really wish we could go into more detail in all of these variations, but that gives it an overview. Honestly, even going through these variations sometimes still left them super complicated, but hope that gave you a good overview of it. Let's go to the next game. This actually moved Bibisara just half a point behind the leaders, so this was pretty significant win, and we'll have to see what happens next. And this game was between Divya and Zhongyi. The tournament hasn't been going well for either of them, but it is admirable how every game they are ready to fight, they're ready to make something interesting happen on the board, and that's exactly what they did in this game. Divya playing as white starts with e4, e5, and then g3. This is a pretty rare move, but it has been played by top players before. It reminds me a bit of the King's Indian attack in this move order. It's basically just an opening to where black can do whatever they want, white can do whatever they want, roughly equal, and the idea is to outplay your opponent in the middle game. That's exactly what we can actually learn from this game, because the middle game was pretty cool too. Black plays d6 and castles, and Divya here plays c4. It looks a bit unusual, but this seems to be her preparation because she played it very quickly. The idea of this, I think, is just to not allow black to have any pawn breaks, so now black doesn't really have d5. They're not going to be able to play b5 as easily, but there is the obvious drawback of that d4 square, which Tan Zhongyi uses immediately and plays knight to d4. This is a completely new position. It has not been played before. So from now on, I think both of them are on their own. She plays h3, knight c3. Both are just developing for now. There's lots of choice of how they could have played it, but what they did made a lot of sense. Finally, some trades are happening. So the bishop took, knight took, and queen took. So although these trades happen, that doesn't mean that they want to draw, because both of them tried really hard to make something happen here in the middle game. White wants to play f4, start an attack. So she does that. I would say it's slightly more pleasant for white. The bishop is just unfortunately stuck between this pawn chain, which we will see becomes very important later. But overall, I like the spirit that Divya is trying to attack and playing g4. And it is typical to do this in such a pawn structure, so it's really white who should try to break through on that side. However, there's another pawn break to go for, which are these central pawn breaks, so each of them tries to make it happen. Black was trying to make something happen too with the g5, but so is white. So finally, Divya goes for d4. Honestly, this so far seems to be going in white's favor, but objectively everything remains equal. Black plays c5, and now there's a huge decision to take for white. Are you going to take anything? Are you going to lock the position up? So a lot to calculate, but overall, if we look at all of them, this capture leads to this, and this is probably better for black because of all of the squares, and suddenly all of black's pieces are working much better. This leads to the exact same position, and taking like this actually gives black an extra option to play c takes d4, and then knight takes c5, roughly equal. Black seems to be more in control of some of these key squares. So instead she plays d5, which makes the most sense. Black now has to play e takes f4, otherwise white will gain way too much space in the position. And black plays this to occupy this important e5 square. So now this square fully belongs to black. I was a bit surprised by rook to e5 that she played, because I thought that this square was really going to be for the knight, but either one works. In either case, they both have counterplay. But rook to e5 runs into knight d3, which allows white to reposition their pieces in a bit of a better way. So the knight goes there, and then the rook lifts itself up to let the other rook come, and now at least white already has something to attack. Black also repositioned, and then rook to f8. To me, this was a key moment in the game. You can pause the video and think of what you would play for white, or for Divya in this case. It's a very, very cool move. It's really worth it to try to find it. But unfortunately, in the game, Divya didn't find it, because there's nobody there telling you this is a key moment. You have to make something happen. And it's very tough to know when that moment is. So the move is e5. We know that usually it's good to do this to free up, it's a positional pawn sacrifice, but it's really not all that positional in some of these lines. In some of these lines, it's very tactical. The idea of this is that after takes, bishop e4, that bishop finally gets space to breathe, and a pawn is a very small price to pay for that. White is now the one starting the attack. The difficult part was knight takes e5, because now knight takes e5, rook takes e5. You might still want to play bishop e4, but now black has g6. And it's very easy to just stop the calculation here and think, yeah, looks like white doesn't have anything. Looks like it's almost working, but not quite there. So when you play e4, you really, well, e5, you really need to see the response to this. Otherwise, white is honestly just worse and gave up a pawn for no reason. But the response is phenomenal. There is bishop g6 sacrifice. Honestly, it looks crazy, but it's actually working. After h takes g6, there is queen g6, which is amazing, because after takes, rook comes in, king h6, and you might think, okay, it's very close, but it's not quite mate, so it's not working. But no, there's h4. This is the only winning move. And it's a quiet move, too, when you've just sacrificed a whole queen and a bishop. There's no defense against rook h8. If g5, there's h5, and these rook checks don't really do anything because white's king runs away. And there's no defense, which honestly I don't think I've ever seen anything like it before, that it actually works out in the game. But I don't think we blame Divya for not seeing that, because it's very phenomenal if this had actually happened. So instead, she doesn't play e5 and plays queen to c1. And after this, she doesn't really get many other chances to turn the game around. Black now is pretty stable with everything on both sides. So she tries to open up the queen side, which was the good thing to do, and maybe she could swing that rook over to the a file, but there also isn't much there to... There aren't many squares to invade to, but this was probably still better than what happened in the game. In the game, she locked it up with a4, and after that, everything shifted to the king side, and black ended up being a bit more prepared for that. So in the game, still some shuffling going on, but black is repositioning all the pieces, still keeping control of that e5 square. And after the trades, it looks like not much has changed, but the difference in the pawn structures and the bishops suddenly starts to matter, because this poor bishop is fully locked up by its own pawns, while that other bishop can attack these pawns, and these pawns can become weaknesses. So she still tries to create that attack with h4 and rook f4, but it's not, the pawn breaks are not really there. Some more shuffling goes on, and white is just feeling tied to the defense. So now both this and this is a weakness, and this rook is never going to be able to move freely. Divya here is at 40 seconds, and Tan Zhongyi is at 35 minutes, which also matters, and for sure makes it more comfortable to play as black. And she goes on to find a fascinating plan. Tan Zhongyi goes on to do that with king f7. It might look crazy, but the king is very safe. And it's just going all the way to c7 to get out of the line of fire and create black pawn breaks on the king side. Now Divya plays h5, and the last pawn goes onto the light square. It's for sure easy to criticize that it's not good to put pawns on the same square as the bishop, but honestly here it doesn't matter as much, and it's hard to find another move because all the pieces are so tied. So one extra pawn doesn't make too big of a difference, but it's just a very tough position to play because white is running out of moves. So everything so far is being held together, but black brings that king over, and now the pawn breaks are really more dangerous for white than they are for black. Because once everything opens up, white's king will be in big danger. And the other problem is that black can choose the timing of them. So white cannot choose it at all and has to shuffle around the pieces, but black is the one in charge. So that's what she does. She shuffles around. She tries to find the best possible place for the queen and the rooks before doing that. So one rook comes to the g file. Now rook f5 is actually a very good try because bishop takes f5 is a dead draw. Queen takes, and no matter what you take with, there's bishop, there's g takes f5, and that bishop is weak, but the rooks also have nothing to do. They have no entry squares, and there's no pawn break. So this is a dead draw, and this is also a dead draw, which is why rook f5 is such a good try. But Tan Zhongyi doesn't want to accept it and wants to keep those pawn break chances alive. So rooks and queen have been repositioned, and after some more shuffling, finally Zhongyi decides it's the right time. Plays g6. It is a tough choice for white because everything opens up the king in an unfavorable way. If they take like this, then rook takes, and rook takes g4. So that pawn suddenly falls, but not only that, it's the king that's the problem. So in the game, she plays rook f6, and after takes, she takes this pawn, but the king is just too open now. Queen f7, everything almost works out, but black has a really, really beautiful move here, rook h8. It's the only winning move, but it's enough. So now this rook cannot do anything because it's protecting the queen, and this rook is also not really able to move. So the only thing left is to take, and then g3, with black checkmating soon. So Divya resigns here. This, I'm sure, is a very frustrating game for her because you seemingly did nothing wrong and nothing bad, but it just gets slowly and slowly squeezed, which is very instructive to look at, but for sure very tough to play when you're in white's shoes. So some very nice plans though, both from the white side and from the black side, with that nice king walk and with very good timing. So this evens out their score, and we have one more game left, which is not as long as the others, but Anna Muzychuk against Alexandra Goryachkina. If you thought any of the previous games were heartbreaking, I think this was the heartbreak of the round. If Anna wins this game, she catches up to the leaders. And we will skip over the opening phase a bit because it was fairly uneventful. Ruy Lopez. Some deep theory for both sides. Even up until this point, still theory. And even 4 games have reached this position before. All of these are very common plans though, so they're both just doing what they usually do. So we're skipping over that. Usually these positions are a fight of who will break open the center first, and white does it first. But black decides to do it too, at the exact same time. Some captures here. White chose the right one. If they take like this, then queen to d5 activates black's pieces a bit more. So she plays this, which is correct. Now black could take with the knight, but this leads to a lot of trades, like this, and then like this, and if they decide to take, then there's bishop here, but at the end of the day, pretty equal. And forced too, so maybe she wanted something more complicated. Played d4, and took one move later. And so far, it's fairly even, and Goryachkina plays b3. This looks harmless, but actually becomes the reason that black is going to have to play an endgame down a pawn. The idea is just to bring the other rook and win this pawn back. So that works, but instead Anna plays c3, which ends up putting some pressure in the center, but not only that, it forces this ending that all of a sudden becomes a problem. If the rook goes here, there's rook to b7, and this pawn is under attack. And if the rook goes here, once again, rook b7, and how to defend this pawn. So suddenly, black needs to choose which pawn to give up. So she decides to give up the c pawn and play bishop to b4. It looks not correct to trade pieces when you're down a pawn, but this is actually the right choice, because rook endings are always the best to play as the defensive side when you're down a pawn. Trading the rooks is great, and these positions usually equal by the computer, but they're not equal in practice. Usually the more pawns, the more chances that the side with the extra pawn can push, and that's exactly what Anna tries to do. But Goryachkina is also a good endgame player, so she knows the principles of how to defend correctly. But as I said, it's always very hard to defend these positions in practice. So now she offers the rook trade, which is generally, I guess, good for the defensive side because you have less material. They traded one pair of pawns, but this came at a trade-off. Now white has an extra pawn that is an outside passer, which is one of the most dangerous pawns to have. Still equal by the computer, but tough in real life. So white limits the black king with rook b7. This is good, not letting the king out. And Goryachkina makes a mistake. Rook to c6. What she should play instead is g5, capture, capture, and b4, king g7. So at least the king can come out and be here, and while the rook is attacking this pawn, while at the same time being able to defend against that pawn advance whenever it wants. Instead, rook c6 kind of plays into white's hand. It attacks the king, but it, in fact, does the opposite. It pushes that king to get closer to the pawn, which is exactly what it wanted to do. Rook g6 back, and it's a tough choice. As white, do you abandon that pawn or do you keep defending it? If you keep defending it, you just keep getting checked. So Anna plays the right thing. She abandons that pawn. Rook takes it, but that pawn gets very, very far. Now the rook gets out of the way to push it to b7. Now the big threat is, of course, rook c8 check and b8. So the king moves away, and there's only one winning move here. And Anna finds it. It is e5, with the idea of e6, if that's allowed. So the king goes away, And there's once again only one winning move. And Anna finds it again. It is h5. If the king takes, then rook takes, and the two passers are just too much to deal with, so this would be completely winning for white. King here instead, trying to win that other pawn. The king defends it, king e6, and guess what? There's only one winning move yet again, and Anna finds it again. It is king c5, sacrificing that pawn, but this king gets really close. Black now needs to put it all on her own pawns, because the rook will have to give itself up. So, at the end of this was perfectly played by Anna. The position is completely winning. The rook is stronger than those two passed pawns. But Goryachkina was going to play until the end. And these positions are so tricky. They're so tricky because these pawns start rolling very quickly, and usually when that rook sacrifices itself, the king is so far that it needs to spend at least 3 or 4 moves to get back into the middle or closer to the pawns. So it becomes very, very calculation-based and very quick and very difficult. Now it's a bit more difficult for white to do this because they are the one that needs to be precise. Luckily for white, the king is close enough to save the day. Anna has 5 minutes here and Alexandra has 8. So far, the technique is good. The king needs to come closer. That's what it does. And as black, you need to push out the opponent's king, so that's what it tries to do. And of course, the pawns need to start rolling. So far, everything's been going well for white. The pawns are blockaded, the king is close. Now it just needs a few more precise moves. A few checks to gain time, and rook a5. g3. Here's where, the last time, we pause the video if you want to try it out yourself. If you don't, you can just keep watching. Would you be able to win this position as white? I feel like there's so many ways to go wrong still, even though it is technically winning. There's 2 moves that win here. One of them is king to f3, which now looking back is probably simpler. The idea is that on h4 you take this pawn with a rook, and then rook to g5, and it's a very cute idea that none of these pawns can move forward because each of them will become undefended. And if the king moves, then we have rook to g4, attacking that pawn, and there's nothing that black can do. So that's one of the winning ideas. And if g2, then rook a1. And if king forward, then rook a2, which is another nice trick to know. And if this, then rook to g1. So to me, this looks like the simpler win, but rook f5 is the other winning move. So if you guessed that, that's good. That's what Anna played in the game. For now, everything is okay. Rook goes back. That's where it belongs. It can attack both the pawns and give some checks. But here's where the critical moment comes. Only one move wins. Anna has 1 minute and 30 seconds on the clock. She starts calculating, but she gets really nervous, and you could see it on her face. She reached with her hand for the king, and in the last second she changed her mind. King g4 was the winning move, and this is the type of game that gives you nightmares for a very long time. Because I'm sure she saw it, but something in the last second scared her. King g4 wins because of h3, rook a2. This makes sense, but it's king h2 that's the hard part. Black is threatening to promote this pawn, so white needs to find rook h5. It's a bit of an unnatural idea, but it works really beautifully. Pawn forward, then rook takes, and the king has to go in front of the pawn, which leaves white just enough time to get their own king close. And rook to f4. So very subtle, very precise, but this is what would work. So now the king has to either step away or step here, but the rook can go around. So this was the win. And it's so sad when she just gave a check instead. And suddenly, after king h3, it's a draw. It's no longer winning because now the king can go back to h2, and this makes the whole difference. King g4 now is not working. That's what she did in the game, but even even on any check, it's just not working anymore. So the issue here is that on every other move, there's a stalemate trick, which is so unfortunate, or well, fortunate for black, but unfortunate for white. But all these stalemate tricks are now existing. So the rook moved out. King went here, but it's too late for king g4 because now there's this extra tempo that black gained. She could have taken here, but this also leads to a complete draw. So instead, rook h3, king h4, and a draw in the end with just two kings left on the board. This was so close to being a perfect conversion, but ended up being one of the very sad moments for the tournament so far, at least for me, because I was really rooting for Anna as a Ukrainian myself, but also because Anna had so many other winning positions in the tournament that ended in a bit of an unfortunate way. But either way, the standings are still very heated and there's 2 rounds left, so hopefully we get to see a good battle for the first place. The current standings are Vaishali and Zhu Jiner in the shared lead with 7 points, Anna and Bibisara at 6.5, Goryachkina and Lagno at 5.5, Divya and Zhongyi at 5. So one round can still change a lot, and every day just gets more and more exciting. I hope you enjoyed the video. Let me know which format you liked better, and hope to see more good games in the last final and most important rounds of the event. So bye-bye and see you later.